Good afternoon. My name is Abe Denmark. I'm the director of the Asia program here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Today we have a very timely discussion about the upcoming round of summitry and dialogue between North Korea, South Korea, and North Korea and the United States. Potentially, if it doesn't actually occur, first ever meeting between sitting American president and leader of North Korea. This event is organized and sponsored by the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center here at the Wilson Center, which is housed in the Asia program. The way we're going to handle things today, we'll have opening remarks from a senior representative from the South Korean Embassy, followed by a panel sitting here before you. So first I'll introduce the representative from the embassy for his opening remarks, and then I'll introduce the panel following his remarks. So I'm very pleased and honored to introduce Mr. Chun Yoo-hoo. He's a minister at the Embassy of the Republic of Korea in Washington. He started this position in middle of March of this year, so he's new to the embassy, but already making his presence felt here in Washington. Prior to the embassy, Mr. Chun was visiting fellow at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He's a career diplomat, previously served as Director General for Bilateral Economic Affairs of Korea from 2015 to 2017, Deputy Consul General at the Korean Consulate General in Chicago, and as Minister Counsel at the Korean Embassy in Brazil. This is his second post at the Embassy in Korea in Washington, where he was an economic counselor between 2007 and 2009. And that is just one of many positions, I think, including First Secretary at the Korean Embassy in Canada and First Secretary at the Korean Embassy in Bulgaria. So he has a very varied and illustrious career. Graduated from Seoul National University with a degree in English Language and Literature, received 2 LLM degrees from Korean University and one from the University of Iowa in 1995. And so with that, I'll welcome Mr. Chun to the stage.
Thank you very much for your kind remarks. It's a great honor to be here for this timely forum at this Woodrow Wilson Center. The title of this forum, New Year, New Strategy, suggests transition and change. The slogan of the upcoming Inter-Korean Summit, Peace, a New Start, hopes to capture the same nuance. Truly, we are witnessing a historic moment of change. Sorry about my hoarse voice. Yeah, I would like to thank Dr. Jong Un from Brookings, Director Abraham Denmark, and Director Jean Lee from the Wilson Center, and Mr. Jake Sullivan from the Carnegie Endowment for your participation today. I look forward to candid and thoughtful discussion. As you all know, leaders from the South and North Korea will meet the day after tomorrow, April 27th, for a historic summit at Panmunjom. It will have been more than a decade since the last such meeting. I know that some in the United States are skeptical about North Korea's overture. Surely, healthy and constructive criticism should be respected. However, we are cautiously optimistic that this time the Inter-Korean Summit and the North Korea-US Summit can be a success. Our previous efforts to create a lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula failed for several reasons. Even though the parties came to an agreement, it was never successfully implemented. Changes of government, bottom-up approaches, and a lack of trust between North Korea and the United States all contributed to their failure. This time, the situation is different. Both the US and the Korean parents are in the early days of their presidencies. They therefore have enough time to implement their promises. Most importantly, this round of talks is being conducted in a top-down manner. Obstacles that prevented the smooth implementation of a previous agreement can be easily solved by our leaders. Finally, the first ever summit meeting between North Korea and the US will be held shortly after the Inter-Korean Summit meeting. North Korea and the United States can talk directly, building trust without the risk of any third-party miscommunication. Some people worry about the hurried pace of proceedings. The truth is that President Moon has been preparing for this from the moment he took office. Ever since his speech in Berlin last year, his administration has presented a consistent policy for peace on the Korean Peninsula. The speed we see is the result of this considerable planning and effort. Some suspect that North Korea's outreach is just a delaying tactic aimed at advancing its nuclear weapon program. Surely, we have a trust problem with North Korea. But this is not just a matter of trust. It's a matter of approaching the opportunity presented with the goodwill that we have built. Besides, North Korea is already feeling the pressure of international sanctions, and I doubt they think that delaying a deal is a viable option. They have also expressed to the international community their willingness for conflict denuclearization. Last Friday, North Korea announced it will suspend its nuclear and missile test and shut down its nuclear test site. We think that North Korea's decision is meaningful progress for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and it will help create a very positive environment for the success of upcoming Inter-Korean and North Korea-US summit. However, we don't expect to resolve every issue with this one meeting. As the saying goes, Rome was not built in a day. Thus, more importantly, the South Korea, North Korea, United States summits are like a three-legged race. Everyone needs to keep pace with each other, even if you want to run at full speed. On the 27th, we hope to make a good start that will facilitate the success of US-North Korea talks. I hope everyone here today can come up with some fresh and deep thought insight for decolonization, the establishment of a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, and the normalization of relations between the two Koreas and the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you. When we were conceiving of this event to be held just before the Inter-Korean Summit, it was very important to us at the Wilson Center that we get the view from Seoul. And so we wanted to, we sent a note to the embassy to see if they were willing to send someone to speak. And we're very pleasantly surprised and very pleased that they agreed to send somebody to give remarks at such a sensitive period. So we're very grateful and thankful for you to come and speak. We'll transition now to the panel itself. Each panelist will speak for 5 to 7 minutes of initial remarks, at which point we'll have a brief discussion here that I'll moderate and then turn things over to Q&A. But first, let me introduce the panelists. You may notice that I am the only person whose name does not begin with J. That's not the only reason why I'm moderating, but it probably has something to do with it. So first speaking is Jung Pak, the Korea Chair and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, having joined there fairly recently after a terrific career both at the CIA and at the National Intelligence Council. Jung focuses on national security challenges facing the United States and East Asia, including North Korea's weapons of mass destruction capabilities, the regime's domestic and foreign policy calculus, internal stability, and inter-Korean ties. Second speaking is Jake Sullivan, who's currently the Martin R. Flug visiting lecturer at Yale Law School. Jake previously served in the Obama administration as National Security Advisor to the Vice President and Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State, as well as Deputy Chief of Staff to the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And third is Jean Lee, who we're very pleased to welcome as our new director of the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Jean is a veteran reporter and correspondent. She was the AP Bureau Chief in Seoul, and in 2011 became the first American journalist to join the Pyongyang Foreign Press Corps, opening the Pyongyang Bureau, the first U.S. news operation in North Korean capital, the following year in 2012. So she has tremendous experience, and if you get a chance, terrific pictures of her time in North Korea, very unique perspective and experiences there. So first, I'll turn things over to Jung for your opening comments.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Abe and Jean, and thank you all for coming on a dreary April day. I want to talk about what is a summit? A summit, when you talk about a mountain, it's the peak, it's the highest point. And Kim Jong-un seems to be punctuating his reach to the top of the mountain with summits with the South Korean president, a meeting with Chinese President Xi, and ultimately a meeting with the sitting U.S. president. So for him, he sees the summits as not just a meeting of the heads of state, but as the peak of his strategy, the peak of his goals, and the peak of his accomplishments. And he's been very clear in the regime's media about how he feels that he has gotten there. At the plenary of the Korean Workers' Party Central Committee recently, Kim verified that he had verified the completion of his nuclear weapons program, declared a new state, and also declared a historic period. All of this language we've seen before in a few years ago when North Korea's constitution was revised to include, or the declaration that North Korea was a nuclear weapons power. It's included in all of these statements that the regime has issued in terms of how the regime North Korea has nuclear weapons, and we should all move along. And I think I've spent a lot of time and career looking at Kim and just watching him. And I would say that I spend an unhealthy amount of time just studying him. Unhealthy emotionally, physically. And I've been interested in how he's been doing maximum pressure and engagement. So our policy, the US policy, has been maximum pressure and maybe engagement at some point. But it turns out Kim is also good at maximum pressure and maximum engagement. What we've seen in the past 7 years was that he went full throttle on the weapons program, and now he's going full on into the maximum engagement, compressing a half a dozen summit meetings with world and regional leaders into a period of 4 or 5 months that would be enviable for any world leader to do. So he's done a pivot from maximum pressure, where he's a rogue, he's a rocket man, he is vilified for everything under the sun, for the human rights violations, for the weapons program, for his for the slew of threatening actions and threats against South Korea, Japan, and the United States. But all of a sudden, as the calendar, we went from 2017 to 2018, he's become an international statesman. Showing up with his wife to these meetings with the world leaders, going to China, meeting with President Xi, meeting with the South Korean envoys to Pyongyang. And by all accounts, he seems pretty confident from the readouts, from the media portrayals, in that he feels confident in this kind of setting as much as he's confident smoking a cigarette at a missile test site. And not only that, I thought it was as if to punctuate that he is an international statesman and a caring, compassionate leader. He showed up at a hospital to meet with the patients who were hurt in a bus accident. It was a bus accident in North Korea that had killed scores of people, including Chinese tour operators. So what does that say? That tells me that he's not just adept at being rogue, but also adept at maximum engagement. And I think those things, while we should be glad and hope for, and everyone should work toward a series of productive summits, I think we should also be mindful about what maximum engagement from Kim Jong Un means. So while we're months away from the locked and loaded and the fire and fury and the bloody nose conversations that dominated last fall and the winter, maximum engagement is also fraught with risks in that maximum engagement makes it much more difficult for sanctions implementation. And if we do believe that sanctions had played a critical role in getting Kim to do this pivot, then we have to make sure that he's not going to diminish that maximum pressure to continue to press North Korea to follow through on what we demand, which is CVID. It's complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of the nuclear weapons. But by all accounts, including Kim's own statements to his people, North Korea is a nuclear state. They don't need to do weapons or missile or ICBM testing anymore. Therefore, he's coming into to these summits from a position of strength. So we should be mindful about some of the expectations. I think this is the miracle of low expectations, where we expect so little from Kim that anything, it seems like a huge opportunity, and we should grab this opportunity, but put that into context. And I'll end by saying that when you reach the peak, the only summit is that we have nowhere to go but down if we don't regain our balance, maintain or approach this with and be sober about how to approach these meetings, because we could teeter off the cliff. Thanks.
Thank you, Jung, for such an optimistic review of the status of things. Turn things over to you, Jake.
Thank you. I've spent a lot of time in the past few years studying Donald Trump to the detriment of my physical and emotional health as well. I was asked to speak a little bit about the U.S. perspective, and I guess I would start by making an observation that builds off of something Jung said about Kim Jong Un's declaration to his own people, that he's achieved the capability, that he has declared they've done it. They've crossed the finish line in terms of having the capability of delivering an ICBM, a nuclear-tipped ICBM, to hold any of their enemies, including the United States, at risk. The interesting moment that we're in right now, indeed it is in some ways a diplomatic sweet spot, is Kim has declared this capability, but the United States' assessment is they haven't yet crossed the finish line. That is the one place you can exist where an extended period of freeze actually works for both sides. It works for Kim because he can say, I don't need to keep testing. I'm done. And therefore, it's not a concession. And it works for the United States because they can say, well, we've stopped him short of the line, and therefore it's not a useless thing because the cat's already out of the bag. Now, there's plenty of debate about how we should actually assess where North Korea stands in terms of its capability development. And I'm not a technical expert to be able to offer an opinion on that. I would only point out what the official position of the U.S. is versus the official position of North Korea is in respect to the progress in the nuclear program. And so it's created this opportunity. Now, so at a baseline, if you are sitting in the White House right now, you're thinking, if I can secure an extended period of calm, freeze, and end to further testing for the indefinite future, I've already made a big step forward. Because a year ago, people were talking about us having to make major concessions just to get that freeze. Now it's just there. It's been offered. And I can say that that is the result of my maximum pressure campaign, combined with bringing the rest of the world along to join us in that. So already I think the Trump administration thinks we've achieved something really significant. And indeed, to the extent that there is an extended period of calm and no further testing, it is something meaningful and to be strongly supported. That is the foundation upon which the Inter-Korean Summit and then the Trump-Kim Summit will be built. Now, in my view, Trump is not going to be satisfied heading into his summit as he thinks about this with some kind of handshake and nice words, and then they both go their separate ways. He is going to want a big bang. He is going to want Kim and him to sit down, not that kind of big bang, probably at least for now, to sit down, work it out as two leaders, come out and say, we've solved the problem. We've solved it. And therefore, I think that he will be inclined to accept a deal on paper that involves commitments by the North Koreans to pursue denuclearization in exchange for commitments by the Americans to do a whole range of things, including potentially a peace treaty, including sanctions relief, including reduction in hostile activities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think Trump will be very open to a deal like that. And this raises the concern that Jung put on the table, which is, from Trump's perspective, that's a positive thing because politically he gets to come home and say all the losers and haters who came before me couldn't get it done, and I, Donald Trump, the ultimate deal maker, I got it done. And whatever the specifics are, we'll let our teams work that out over the next many years. And in many ways, inverting the process so the leaders come first before you have months of preparation works to a kind of Trumpian logic of, I go sit down with the big man on the other side, we work out the deal, we solve the problem, and then the sequencing and the specifics get left to somebody else. I think that is the context within which the thrust of American policy as things stand right now. And despite the fact that you now see an effort inside the U.S. government to say, hold on a sec, we're not going to give anything until we really see progress and so forth, that may all be. I don't think there'll be formal granting of any form of sanctions relief until the North Koreans actually take concrete steps. But the mere fact of this kind of outcome or potential outcome is going to lead China to make its own decisions about how it relates to North Korea, which I think will alleviate a considerable amount of the sanctions pressure. And of course, it will color President Moon Jae-in's approach to his own summit because he's seeing Donald Trump running very quickly down this track. And I think he thinks, well, I'm not going to be the one pulling things back. I'm not going to be slowing down. And therefore, I think it will have an impact psychologically and otherwise on the way that President Moon approaches his meetings with Kim Jong Un the day after tomorrow. Now, there are two factors in this that I have yet to be able to quite figure out. One of them is John Bolton. So Mike Pompeo is deeply invested in this, as we all know at this point, wants to make it succeed, I think is working hand in hand with Trump on this basic gambit that I've described. Despite his relatively hawkish views on North Korea, he's all in on this diplomacy. Bolton has a very strong predilection for, shall we say, the kinetic or military option when it comes to North Korea, and is not particularly interested in any diplomacy that involves a set of promises that he thinks are not worth the paper they're printed on. But I think he will go along with this play for quite some time, and will return to the question about whether the military option is ultimately going to have to be exercised by the United States at some point further into the future. But he's a wild card in this. And then the other question is, if in fact there's a series of pledges made on both sides, how do the months following the summit actually unfold? What is the process? What is the means by which the United States, South Korea, and others end up trying to actually convert that into some meaningful, tangible progress forward? And there, I think we have a lot less clarity about how the United States will be postured to work both with our South Korean partners and with North Korea to make progress here. And the final thing that I will say is, what happens if where North Korea goes in terms of its pledges or promises really focuses on the ICBM program and puts off to one side the short-range missile program and says, nope, we're not really going to touch that. That's regional security and the like. But we can talk ICBMs. And Trump says, well, that sounds pretty good to me because I'm fundamentally interested in protecting the U.S. homeland. This, I think, is one of the areas where you could see Kim try to exploit gaps among the allies. And I think the United States has to be very focused on making sure that we maintain absolute rock-solid solidarity with South Korea and with Japan as we enter the perilous waters around this summit. So those are some initial observations from my point of view, relating to how I think the Americans are approaching the Trump-Kim summit, but I think they end up having, both from a contextual perspective and on specific issues, real impact on the way that President Moon is thinking and that Kim Jong Un is thinking as they enter the Inter-Korean Summit in the days ahead. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you. Jean.
So the journalist in me is dying to follow up with you guys on some of these points. But I think I will just offer a few observations from perhaps the perspective of somebody who spent quite a lot of time in South Korea and North Korea. I think I probably, I'm not sure who has spent an unhealthier amount of time studying Kim Jong Un between me and Jung. We'd be going to blows over that one, because I have been covering Korea for more than 20 years. And certainly was on the ground in Pyongyang during those moments when he made his first appearance to the people, and in those early years of his leadership. So have really watched this young man step into this role, and it's been a fascinating, at times alarming vantage point. But I think that one thing I want to point out, I want to talk a little bit about the upcoming Korean summit, because I think that we here in Washington and here in the U.S. tend to just jump forward and look at that anticipated Trump-Kim summit. But I just want to draw some attention back to the summit that's happening essentially tomorrow. It'll start tomorrow night for us here in Washington, D.C. Just a couple thoughts. I was actually a young reporter in 2000 covering that first Inter-Korean Summit. And we actually, I think we printed out some of my old stories, and I haven't had a chance to look at them. But what I can tell you is that the mood in South Korea was entirely different at the time. This was the first time the Korean leaders sat down for a summit, absolutely historic. I remember at the time as a journalist, one thing I noticed was that there was this sense of, I think I called it Mao fever. It's not the right term, but a little bit of a fascination with communism, in a sense, in South Korea. It was just, they were so excited at this prospect of a changed relationship with North Korea. So much hope and so much promise. However, it has been, I hate to say 18 years. It makes me realize how long I've been a journalist. But 18 years later, I think the mood is a little bit different in South Korea, and I just want to acknowledge that. 18 years later, my students in South Korea, who have only really grown up with tension with North Korea and with a national security law that prohibits them from accessing information about North Korea, have only seen North Koreans as their poor brethren on the other side of the DMZ, and also as, in some ways, their adversaries. And so their feelings towards reconciliation and potential reunification are very different today than the generation 20 years ago that was welcoming this period that we call the Sunshine Era. It's just something to keep in mind. I have been writing about this in a sense because it has huge ramifications for, I think, the South Korean government, and I think the President Moon experienced a little bit of that backlash with the Olympics, with that younger generation. It just has huge ramifications because that next generation, this younger generation, is the one that is going to shoulder the burden of reconciliation and possible reunification. So it's something to keep in mind. That said, I cannot tell you that how much better it is to have the two sides talking rather than trading insults or exchanging provocations. One of the things, I was actually making a trip with a study group to the DMZ in 2015, and we were kept from entering the DMZ for about an hour. And it turned out it was because, I think they had some concerns because they knew I was a journalist, but also it turns out that there had been a landmine incident inside the DMZ where the North Koreans had come across the DMZ over to the South Korean side, planted some mines in the middle of the night, and we had 2 South Korean soldiers who were injured. And so very, very real, the kind of tensions that still exist. I think what I tell my students, and some of my students are here today, is that you have to care about what happens with the future of this relationship with North Korea, because like it or not, North Korea is going to make its presence known. North Koreans tell me that they feel somewhat abandoned by South Korea. They know they are somewhat cut off from the outside world. They don't have access to the internet like we do, but they are very well aware that their country is much poorer than South Korea's. And their big concern to me was, have they forgotten about us? Have they left us behind? This summit, we will see a strong show of Korean unity. And part of that, there's a lot of messaging around that will play well in Pyongyang for Kim Jong Un. He'll be able to tell his people, look, they haven't forgotten about us. It'll certainly be risky because anytime you have a show of Korean unity, there's a slight tinge of, we can do this on our own. We don't need outside intervention. And so it puts some risk, there's some risk to the US-ROK alliance with that kind of a show of unity. I do want to mention also that we have to remember that this is going to be an incredible opportunity for us to see how Kim Jong Un operates in this setting. You know, as Jong and I can tell you, we've heard so much about him for the last couple of years, and we've been studying him closely, but he has really only been in the public eye since 2010. That's only 8 years ago. We know so little about him, and we are getting to know him now. We are watching his persona and his policy unfold before us, and I think this summit will be an incredible opportunity to see how he interacts, how he behaves. I find it fascinating the South Koreans and the North Koreans are orchestrating this so closely. I mean, I think we're seeing things like they're going to be sitting 2018 centimeters apart. So much significance going into the planning of this summit, and that says something to the importance of the messaging around it. But I suspect we'll be in for some surprises as well, and I am looking forward to that. But remember also that this interaction will provide incredibly valuable information as we go into that anticipated summit between Trump and Kim. The South Koreans will be able to preserve their place and their role in this whole discussion by being able to share that information. So we should not forget that this summit has a very important role in setting the ground for an upcoming U.S.-North Korea summit. So please pay attention in the next couple of days. I wanted to address one point as well. Jong, you mentioned, and I think this is a debate, CNN had asked me to write about 200 words about, is Kim Jong Un going into all of this from a position of strength? And I do think, yes, I mean, this is a smart, you have to admit, a smart move. If he had gone into these meetings with the Chinese leader, with the US leader, with the South Korean leader, as a young 20-something son who inherited power, a young man that nobody knew, who had no experience that we knew of, would have been a very different situation. But he is going into these meetings now as a leader who has proven to his people that he can defend them with a verifiably threatening nuclear program. And so he is going into this from a position of strength. But I want to say it's a position of relative strength, because let's put things into perspective, and let's understand also that he is under a lot of pressure. Let's remember that this is a very poor country that has poured meager resources into a costly nuclear weapons program that honestly that they can't maintain. If he wants to hold on to power, he also has to move away from that and address the poverty in the country, and that's precisely perhaps part of the strategy. So even though he's going into this, he believes he's going into this as an equal, or is portraying himself as an equal, we have to remember that this is still a very, very poor country with a lot at stake down the road, with sanctions so tight at this moment, sanctions that are going to put a real pinch on the people in the months and years to come if this situation isn't resolved. I think that's it for me for now. Abe, I know you're going to draw us into a conversation.
So thank you all for your comments. I wanted to start thinking about this deal within the context, this potential deal that's in development in the context of other agreements that have been made with North Korea in the past. Our Korea Center is a Center for Korean History and Public Policy, so we wanted to put this in appropriate context. We've made agreements about denuclearizing North Korea several times in the past, 1994, 2005. In fact, I found an article by Helene Cooper in 2007 in the New York Times saying that North Korea had agreed to disable all of its nuclear facilities by the end of the year, a move that the Bush administration hailed as a diplomatic victory that could serve as a model for how to deal with Iran, ironically. And later on, the article mentioned that critics note that the accord bears a strong resemblance to the 1994 agreement between North Korea and the Clinton administration, one that the Bush administration officials denounced in the past as a giveaway, which fell apart in 2002. So my question for all three of you really is that if we are to put together some sort of an agreement with North Korea that includes commitments to denuclearization, includes commitments to other sort of concessions that they would want, how are we going to see this within the context of other agreements that really agreed to the same thing that did eventually collapse? As some of us say during Passover, why is this agreement different than all other agreements? So I just throw it open to any of you.
Well, I'll make one observation, but connected to a question to both Jung and Jean that was raised by their presentations that I'm curious for their take on, because I think the answer to this question will say a lot about where this all goes. So the observation is, I expect that if I had to predict, I think the outcome of all of this with respect to the nuclear file will be something akin to 2005. A joint statement that I went back and read it not too long ago and was struck by its breadth, in fact, by the extent to which it put really significant kind of commitments on the table from both sides to resolve a lot of the outstanding issues. I think Trump would probably be prepared to go even further than that, frankly, because for him, he's got there's nothing that he feels is just an off-limits, off-the-table thing to talk about. So he may even be prepared to add more items on his side of the table in return for more flowery commitments from the North Korean side. So I think 2005 gives you not a bad model for this. He, of course, will say nothing like this has ever happened in human history, and will not be familiar with what happened in 2005 or 1994. But the interesting question that and I'll say one other thing, which is I was in the Obama administration when we did the Leap Day deal in 2012. And of course, the Leap Day deal fell apart. First of all, you should probably never do a deal on February 29th because almost by definition, you're picking some, it only comes around once every 4 years. It's like it doesn't really exist. And in fact, it didn't because of the issue of space launches. And I will be interested to see whether the North Koreans have actually internalized the lesson from the Leap Day deal as they start thinking about space launches and so forth later on down the line. And I'm interested in other people's perspective on that. The question I want to ask is, how much did sanctions, combined with the credible threat of military force, but especially the sanctions, the pinch of sanctions, how much was that part of the motivation for Kim going to, as Jung put it, maximum engagement, and how much of it was just, where they felt they were in the technical development, and they felt they could make this turn, that Kim felt he could make this turn. Because if the answer is that sanctions really had a lot to do with it, A, it says something about the relative strength that Kim is coming to the table with, but B, it probably tells us a lot about what he's up to here, and how much just getting alleviation from the pressure of sanctions is his near-term goal, as opposed to something else. So for me, that's a huge open question. The Trump administration would tell you, we did it. We made this happen. I'd be interested in your guys' take on, from the North Korean perspective.
So I think this is a really interesting question. I don't think there's an absolute answer.
Right.
One of the things that I argue, and I wrote all last year, that this will play out this way. So to me, none of this is a surprise. And I looked back at a piece that I wrote and published last year, and I think if you look at the nut graph, and I tweeted this, I say that things are playing out exactly the way that I wrote in the story. I don't have it in front of me, so I can't read it, but I did say that would end with getting Trump to the negotiating table to discuss a peace treaty. So people thought I was insane when I was talking about this last year. And the reason I mentioned this is that, to me, it's not surprising. It's fairly predictable in a sense, because I think that North Korea had a certain timeline. One of the reasons why, when I mentioned earlier that they're saying that they are going to be sitting 2018 centimeters apart, the leaders, is because 2018 is a significant year in both the North Korean and the South Korean calendars. 70 years ago this year, both the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea were established. So both North Korea and South Korea were established. It's also the 65th anniversary of the armistice, the signing of the ceasefire from the Korean War. So these are the kind of dates that the North Koreans pay close attention to. I do think that Kim Jong Un used the rhetoric from the White House to justify and ramp up testing of his nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, with the idea that if he could get that program to a point where he was happy with it by the end of the year, that he could make this shift. That said, and I should also point out that North Koreans have been living with sanctions for decades. So sanctions are nothing new. When I'm in North Korea, they're always portrayed as part of the hostile policy on the part of the U.S. government. And so North Koreans are always told, this is because of the United States. They've got a hostile policy. You just have to live with it. However, the sanctions are so tight now, and certainly when I was there last year, there were concerns among the elites who were saying, if China signs on to these sanctions, we are going to be in trouble because we rely on fuel, in particular, from China. We cannot operate our businesses, our tractors. We can't get food out to the countryside if there is a fuel embargo. Now, China did agree to a partial fuel embargo last year, and so that has certainly put a pinch on how North Korea operates. And I think that in the long run, sanctions will have an effect, and Kim Jong Un is aware of that.
I think it's a basket of things, Jake, and I agree with you on the 2005 agreement. There's no. I don't think we need to recreate the wheel, because I think that's a pretty comprehensive agreement. Of course, it was a different time. On what are Kim's drivers for this outreach? I think it's luck. I think it's just random timing, but also human agency. So I'll put sanctions in that basket of part of that basket of what drove him here to this point. It's also the technological advancements. I mean, I remember being in the, Abe, you know this, right? Where there was a missile test every 2 weeks, and you just get so desensitized to this, and he just kept going. And these were not provocations in that they were trying to get a rise out of us, but that they were just doing R&D for a number of years, for 2 or 3 years. So it's the technological development, and the resources that Kim poured into it to reach this point. It's the sanctions. It is. It's also domestic drivers, but also I think he saw an opportunity. So why do the ICBM test last year? Why, what was up with that pace that he took last year. And one of the things that I wrote last year was that that he saw an opportunity with a U.S. president who's not like any other president, who has been for decades suspicious of alliances, and who's very open about that in clocking the South Korean president over the head during the state visit, talking about the trade imbalance and burden sharing type issues. So there's that one side of that opportunity. The other side is the opportunity of a progressive liberal president after 10 years of a conservative, two conservative presidents from South Korea who we had to catch up with in terms of maximum pressure. So we have that convergence, and I suspect that Kim saw an opportunity in doing that, in doing these things, and then coming to the table to try to cement his advancements and his achievements early on in the two presidents' administrations. I think this also brings up the question of time. Last fall and last winter, we were talking about time is running out. Everybody was saying that time is running out. Yeah. This is not the time for talks. This is, North Korea is going to have ICBM capabilities in 2 months' time or 3 months' time. So we all felt like we were running out of time. Time has slowed down since January 1st, 2018. And that's also to North Korea's benefit, in that the longer we draw out negotiations, and I'm not advocating either way, the longer we draw out negotiations, the longer we talk about what does denuclearization mean, because North Koreans have a different definition of what our definition is. The administration has included chemical and biological weapons to denuclearization, and what sorts of things we want to add to the mix. Where are we going to meet? What do we mean by hostile policy? What do we mean by a peace mechanism or a peace treaty? All those things take time. And the longer time passes, the stronger is the North Korean argument that they're a de facto nuclear power. They would have secured all these meetings with the world leaders, and that because no one wants to go back to locked and loaded again, everybody's emotionally, physically, intellectually invested in making sure that the summits work. So in any case, I think it's a basket of things, both good and bad. But I think that North Korea's maximum engagement takes a lot more effort and energy and diplomacy and subtlety and nuance than what we've seen from this administration.
That's terrific, and I wanted to build off of Jung's point about timing. So I think timing there's some other aspects to this that don't get discussed as much. To build on your last point, North Korea still has not frozen its programs. It's frozen certain aspects of testing, right? No nuclear tests, and no testing of certain classes of ballistic missiles, although some ballistic missiles were not included in its list, including space launch vehicles, as well as other shorter range ballistic missiles. But even short of that, their nuclear scientists are still able to do their work. Their plutonium programs, their uranium programs are still churning out their stuff. Just so long as they're not conducting these full-up tests, their program is still moving. So as time goes along, their capabilities can continue to improve. But I also wanted to mention timing in terms of the time aperture of the various major players. And I think things are lining up in that way as well. That makes things very interesting. In the last two inter-Korean summits, they occurred towards the end of a South Korean government's administration in the last few months and years. This is happening in the beginning of the Moon administration, and he has a 5-year time horizon. This is happening towards the beginning of President Trump's time as president, and he has 3 or 7 more years in his time of office. Kim Jong Un is looking at, as a young man, he's looking at 30 years at least in power in North Korea. So the differences in those time horizons, I also think, play a large role in how these negotiations come out, and that Kim is operating from a much longer timeline. Mm-hmm. And if he can keep stringing things out and get a few concessions here and there with this administration, and then the next administration, it does seem to, over time, as Jung said, put him in a stronger position.
Can I just add one point on that? Because I think there's something really to this. I mean, let's say Bolton and Pompeo agree with Trump. Actually, the 80% solution is the best solution. You will have solved the problem between now and 2020 if you merely get a good negotiating process going. And granted, they'll continue with certain aspects of their program, although maybe they'll agree to more freezes. They'll be doing some stuff. But they won't be doing what they were doing last year, and they'll have continued to make these commitments. That's good enough. And you could see an American president, even Donald Trump, thinking, not bad. And that structural advantage for Kim is something I think we have to be very worried about.
Go ahead.
On summits, I think we have to be mindful or watch very carefully how Kim does these summits. So right now we're at the beginning of the process of summitry. And there's some back and forth and confusion about what Kim reportedly said about returning to the six-party talks. So the six-party talks have been dead since 2008. And what I see with how Kim sees the summits is to divide and conquer. And this is something that we have worked, on in the government, and looking at this from the outside. That, I saw Kim's trip to Beijing as a way to undermine President Moon, and to undermine the narrative that the South Korean president is in the driver's seat of events on the Korean Peninsula. There was talk of Kim visiting Putin as well back in 2015. So there's talk of a Putin-Kim meeting. So if he goes to Russia, that's a way of undermining China. If he goes to in meeting with the U.S., it's a way of undermining everybody. So having these bilateral type summits and allowing Kim to continue on with bilaterally meeting with leaders, I think would be something that we should be very cautious about. There's a lot of risk in that. Just think about all the legwork that has to be done just to make sure that Japan and South Korea is on the same page, all the phone conversations that have to go on, all the trilats that are being planned just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So one of Kim's tactics is to divide and conquer, and summits are no different from that strategy.
I agree completely. That's a classic North Korean tactic. They did it with us as journalists, trying to divide and conquer the Foreign Press Corps. So my way of fighting that as a journalist was to get together with the Chinese and Russian media and make sure we were all really tight. And I think that that's true for dealing with North Korea, that you have to maintain a sense of unity. The partners have to maintain a sense of unity in order to fight against that tendency to divide and conquer. The dividing and conquer, what I think the tendency is for the national priorities of these various actors to bubble up to the surface, and that makes it easier for North Korea to target those vulnerabilities and to target those national priorities, to use that against the other party. So South Korea and Japan, U.S. and China, U.S. and South Korea.
And Jake pointed to that one of the key areas. I think the nightmare for our friends in Japan and Korea is that the president walks in focusing on ICBMs and letting that be good enough. And that's specifically what folks in Tokyo and Seoul are hoping to.
And it was, we were calling this Korea passing in this Konglish phrase in South Korea. And then I heard it was then being called Japan passing, the feeling that you're being bypassed if there's a bilateral U.S. DPRK discussion. And I wanted to mention one thing when you talked about your timeline, and you mentioned that Kim Jong Un is going to be ruling for 30 plus years to come. That is if he's in a truly solid place with his leadership. I think that he has spent the last 6 years trying to make sure he had that place, and all of what we've been seeing, including the building up of the nuclear weapons program, was part of securing his place. So just mentioning that takes, we have to take into account his own domestic needs.
So the next question I wanted to ask goes to after the summit. Assuming that there's some sort of agreement that comes out between Moon and Kim, some sort of agreement that comes out between Kim and Trump, what happens then? Jung, you mentioned that really after the summit all you have is the cliff, right? Which I've actually written about too. To be honest, if I were advising the president, I would try to make any discussion of a plan B verboten. because that increases your leverage. Like either take the deal or there's nothing but catastrophe other than the deal. So I actually think it makes some sense strategically to not talk about what happens if diplomacy fails. But one of the things I've also said is that the deal is the easy part. As difficult and complicated as it is, it's what happens after the deal that really trips these things up. We mentioned the agreement in 2005, which is a pretty good model for an agreement with the United States and North Korea. Of course, North Korea tested its first nuclear weapon like 13 months after that agreement was signed. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about this, what happens after some sort of an agreement in terms of implementation and sequencing, but also in terms of verification. And if we can sketch out perhaps some of the challenges that we expect to hear about after these meetings happen, if there's agreements, after these agreements occur, and give a preview of coming attractions.
So, I mean, they're supposed, she might go to North Korea to talk about things in June. There's talk, the President Moon has talked about a trilateral, with the U.S. and North Korea. Japan has maybe, wants to talk about, have a summit. So I don't think that after the Trump-Kim meeting, I don't think we end with the symmetry there. I think we're going to the trilateral, quadrilateral territory, and other bilaterals. So I think that, and that takes time too, right? And in going back to the time theme, it's going to be difficult to try to get everybody on the same page. Maximum pressure is really easy, or relatively easy, when North Korea is being bad. The missile tests, the ICBM tests, the nuclear test, the incendiary rhetoric, that was really useful in getting everybody on board on maximum pressure. But it's much more difficult when North Korea is on this charm offensive. And I think, I've loved that phrase because it's a charm and offensive in the same phrase to describe this exactly what the North Koreans are doing. It's offensive, not a charming thing in and of its own right. So that's much more difficult to do. Already, we're seeing at least reports of the Chinese loosening up on the maximum pressure with the North Korean laborers going back to their restaurants. And so what does that mean for maximum pressure? If maximum pressure is what got North Korea to come to the table to talk, then we still need to have it there to maintain that leverage and to increase that leverage.
Just a couple of thoughts on top of that. I'll start where Jung ended. I think this is going to be the key. Does the United States have the diplomatic wherewithal to be systematic and dogged about working with Beijing and Seoul in particular on maintaining pressure? I have my doubts about whether our government is actually set up to do that, because a lot of this is, I know this better from the Iran context, but it requires just an immense mobilization of effort to keep this going. And when you don't have the natural physics of people coming along because of the tests, as Jung was saying, you got to do it through elbow grease. And I'm not at all convinced that we're just physically, institutionally, bureaucratically set up to succeed in that. And that means that Kim will be beginning to harvest the fruits of this agreement, even though formally he's getting no sanctions relief in the near term. Practically, he will be. And I think that's a huge thing for us collectively to worry about. So that's first, and foot stomping what Jung said. Second question for me is, Trump will be very excited for a considerable period of time if, in fact, there's some sort of agreement, and say, I've done it, I've solved it, all the idiots and, haters, be damned. But at some point, he's going to want to see something else, some progress. And so the question for me is, are the North Koreans prepared to do certain things, to blow something up, to dismantle something, to have more tangible shows that this is moving, even if the ultimate destination is never going to be arrived at. And my guess is, I defer to people who are more expert than me, is that they probably will be prepared to play that game to a certain extent. And I think you'll probably see that over the course of 2018 and beyond, that there will be demonstrable acts in furtherance of whatever the agreement was, even if those acts are in a way more aesthetic than deeply substantive. And then I think the third big question for me, which I posed in my opening, is when we get to the fall, does North Korea think, okay, we're reaching that time of year where we want to do our satellite launch, and it's not covered technically under the agreement, so we can do it? Or have they learned the lesson of the Leap Day deal? I think they probably have, personally, and that they will forbear on that. But, I again defer to more expert perspectives. So I think those are, in addition to what Jung said, a couple of other thoughts in terms of how I see this going. And then otherwise, I think that there is going to be this incredible variable geometry of meetings, and almost like industrial complex built up around bilateral, trilateral, multilateral talks, because it's in everyone's interest to do that. And that can go on for quite some time, as long as there's not an intervening provocative act like a satellite launch.
It's about time for us to open things up for questions. I'll call on people. I'll try to group a couple questions together. Please state your name and affiliation, and please keep your questions short and make sure they end with a question mark. Yes, in the front right here.
Thank you. Siang from the Voice of America. I wonder whether panelists can predict the result of the inter-Korean talks. And also, I know Mr. Denmark and Mr. Sullivan talk about the risk of an agreement between Kim and President Trump. So I'm wondering, do you foresee risk for a successful inter-Korean talks? And Ms. Lee mentioned mentioned in passing about the risk of a successful inter-Korean talks. You were thinking that if Koreans can solve the problem, maybe they do not need the external interference. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we'll try to group a couple questions together, since I see a lot of hands raised. So let's go right back there.
Thanks, Abe. Lu Zhenhua from South China Morning Post of Hong Kong. I wonder if panelists can comment on the Trump administration's plan to nominate Admiral Harry Harris to be the new U.S. ambassador to Seoul. Why him? What his possible impact for the upcoming summit? And Abe, could you explain that you already commented that this nomination could complicate the line of authority in Seoul? I'm not quite follow the meaning. Could you elaborate on that? Thanks.
Sure. Okay. Anybody want to comment on some of the questions? I could kick things off if you want.
Or I don't know.
So your question was the risk.
Or what the outcome and
Yeah.
what outcome.
I mean, I think with this inter-Korean summit, it will be very different from past inter-Korean summits, the ones in 2000 and 2007. If you look closely at the delegation on the South Korean side, it's a very interesting makeup of ministers who will be attending this meeting. And there's nobody who has an economic background. So in past summits, there was a lot of focus on economic cooperation. But I think that it's very clear that this is going to be about policy and about denuclearization. So that's one thing. I do think, though, that though there may be a show of unity, the South Korean president is going to be very careful not to put the U.S.-South Korean relationship and that alliance at risk. So he's in a delicate position. So when I say I think the risk, there's a lot of benefit to the North Koreans to show this Korean unity. The South Koreans will also want to try to get younger South Koreans on board to this idea of reconciliation. but they're also going to be very careful to make sure it doesn't put the U.S. ROK alliance at risk. So we'll see I think we'll see a statement of unity of some sort, but I'm not sure how much more we're going to get beyond that.
Yeah, personally, I'm not too concerned about the Inter-Korean Summit. I think President Moon and the ROK government has been very careful in their engagements with the U.S. The risks of these engagements are that they go further than either side would be willing to go in either terms of concessions or not far enough in terms of demands. But I really have personally, I don't really have any concerns because I think President Moon especially has been very careful in his engagements with the United States to make sure that we line up.
Just to reinforce that, I mean, having come into the Obama administration when President Obama came and being at the State Department with Secretary Clinton, both of them new to their jobs, it's hard to hit the ground running and perform the kind of balancing act that both displays openness to reconciliation and diplomacy with North Korea and tough-mindedness around participating in the maximum pressure campaign and staying close to the United States. And I have to say President Moon has managed that for a new guy, as people have pointed out, quite impressively.
Yeah.
And I don't see any reason to believe that he won't manage this summit in a similar way. And as Jean said, he's made sure the agenda and the context is very much targeted at our common priority here, as opposed to letting Kim Jong Un drive the agenda. So I'm impressed with that. I would just say on Harry Harris, I know him well. I work closely with him. He was Secretary Clinton's military advisor for 2 years and traveled around the world with him. And I have great respect for Admiral Harris. He's a genuine public servant and a very talented guy. And I think he will sort out whatever, the shift from military to civilian, I think, quite effectively if he's confirmed.
On President Moon, I'm in complete agreement with Jake on how he's been able to balance. But, he's not really a newbie, right? I think he told some media executives that he's been thinking about this for 10 years, from when he was chief of staff to President Roh Moo-hyun. So he's been thinking about this for 10 years. He's been preparing for this moment for 10 years. And the fact that he's been able to walk this treacherous line of the U.S. on one side, North Korea on the other side, and China with its economic tactics on the other side, that so far it's been a pretty masterful stroke of political work.
Yeah, I should have mentioned on Admiral Harris. I've known Admiral Harris for years, since before he was PACOM commander, and really just think the world of him. I think he's a terrific leader, and I think he would be a terrific ambassador either in Australia or in South Korea, really any place. I do think he would make the transition from military service to civilian life well. For those of you who didn't see, I made a sort of minor comment on Twitter that is being referred to, saying that it could complicate aspects on the Korean Peninsula, only referring to that there is a very close relationship between the U.S. and ROK militaries through the Combined Forces Command, which is headed by a four-star general, usually Army general, and that it would potentially lead to a more complicated situation with a retired four-star and an active duty four-star. And we've seen in the past that those sorts of relationships grow complex. And I think it would just put Admiral Harris potentially in a bit of a delicate situation, especially dealing with the ROK government on issues related to military affairs. It was a fairly minor point and really has nothing to do with Admiral Harris as a person. I think he would, if confirmed, I think he would be an absolutely terrific ambassador, either in Korea or Australia, or wherever they would want to send him. And I'm glad that he's going to be able to continue public service. Yes, we have, let's do John and then in the back there. Let's do John up front. And
Colin, Sarah.
Yeah, did you have your hand up too? Let's just, yeah. Please, you go first.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm a student at Georgetown, and I was actually a former student of Jean Lee's, so I'm really excited to be here. So, assuming that the Kim regime sees security of the current government as its top priority, and they've said in the past that nuclear weapons are essential to this security, how would denuclearization help them accomplish this from the North Korean perspective? And like, why should the U.S. be hopeful that this would make sense to the North Korean government?
I would love to hear your guys'
I'm
take
sorry,
on
I
this.
didn't catch that question. I don't understand your question. So are you asking North Korea is looking for security guarantees and?
So
She's saying, why would they denuclearize?
yeah, like why would it make sense for them to denuclearize from their perspective if their goal is to maintain the current regime? Or maybe that's not true, but that's my understanding of the issue.
There's no reason for them to denuclearize. I mean, they see the nuclear weapons as their treasured sword of, what is it, justice, John? Treasured sword of justice or peace or something that way. And I keep pointing back to, I mean, Kim has been pretty transparent about how he feels about his nuclear weapons. It's his button. It's in his office. It's my nuclear weapons. I'm, providing guidance on this warhead. I'm overseeing all these missile tests. North Korea as a nuclear power is in its constitution since 2013. Everything flows from that nuclear power. The prestige, the relevance, the prosperity of the people. So it doesn't make sense for them to denuclearize. And their talk about that they'll denuclearize, they'll consider denuclearization once the U.S. gets rid of its hostile policy. We've all heard this before. Hostile policy is in the eye of the beholder. North Korea gets to define what the hostile policy is. So when we talk about, don't do space launches, they see that as hostile policy. Whereas we're saying that it's testing ballistic missile technology. So, I think we have to demand things of North Korea too, and not reward them for simply not doing what they're not supposed to be doing in the first place. And that is, if they're talking about a peace regime or peace treaty, start dismantling some of their artillery, or get rid of their artillery or their landmines, along the border. Say that they're not going to be challenging South Korea along the NLL with the crab season coming up in the spring, in the fall, or summer rather, and so make them do something tangible. And Jake had pointed to this before. What is that tangible thing? Maybe it's blowing up a Yongbyon again, right? But I think in this instance, it's hard for me to find a reason for Kim to denuclearize now, because what has it gotten him? It's gotten him prestige. He's getting all these summits.
Can I ask a question about this? So a year ago, it was pretty commonly said that Kim would never even put denuclearization on the table, that he was different from his father and grandfather, and there was questions about, how do you arrange diplomacy in a context in which the North isn't prepared to say that anymore. That obviously turned out not to be quite right. Is it possible that, as he makes this turn to the economy and so forth, that we should go back to what I think is a foundational assumption of all of us going back many years now, that there's no way in heck he's ever giving up his nuclear weapons? I mean, should we revisit that? Like, is it worth kind of zero basing this thing? Yeah. I just put the question out there. I don't know.
So I'm just going to make a point, which is that the Leap Day deal was something that his father signed off on and really wanted to have in place before he passed away. I remember this intimately because I broke that story about the Leap Day deal. And it was, I think I broke the story and put it out. I was in Beijing and I was literally on my way to open the AP bureau in Pyongyang, and we got the word that Kim Jong Un had died. So I broke the story on, I think it was December 17th or 18th, that the Americans were negotiating this deal that would include a moratorium. And then, so it was really on his deathbed or on the right before he passed away that he signed off on this. And I look at this now and I realize, oh, okay, so this deal that we signed on February 29th was so early in Kim Jong Un's leadership, and maybe he decided it wasn't the right time for him. But this was a deal that his father negotiated. So his father actually wanted to place a moratorium on testing. I just want to mention that the North Koreans, what I hear from the North Korean side in Pyongyang is the only reason we have these weapons, or we're building up these weapons, is to protect us from aggression from the United States. And the only reason we need this protection is because the Korean War never ended. And so they see this as a way to force the Americans to come to the table to discuss a peace treaty. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but where does that leave them at the end of the day if
Yeah.
the U.S. does the peace treaty? I mean, I've been
Yeah.
basically where Jung is, which is even so, they're not going to,
I
even
agree.
if we give, they won't give them up.
I agree.
Right.
I don't think they'll give them up either. What this is masterful positioning on the part of Kim Jong Un. He put out this really dramatic declaration the other day. I believe in a nuclear weapons-free world.
Oh, right.
And it puts him in a position now to go into these summits as somebody who champions a nuclear-free world. And so when he gets to that table and he says, listen, I won't need these weapons if you pull your troops or you remove the nuclear umbrella from Northeast Asia. And if the U.S. doesn't agree to that, then he can say, well, I guess I still need my nuclear weapons.
So I had a few thoughts on this. I think to directly answer your question, I don't think any country, I don't think North Korea needs nuclear weapons. I think as a foundational statement. Nuclear weapons are not a guarantor of regime survival. Just ask the folks in Moscow. Nuclear weapons do not prevent other countries from attacking you. Just ask our friends in India. And nuclear weapons are not necessary for your country to survive. There's hundreds of countries existing right now without nuclear weapons, and they're doing okay. So this is a decision that Kim Jong Un is making, that he believes he needs nuclear weapons. I join everybody else in being very skeptical that North Korea will ever give up its nuclear weapons. But history is replete with examples of countries making major changes to its policies. And in fact, if countries just stayed the same and never changed, then our jobs would be a lot easier. So I think that it's certainly worth testing the hypothesis and sitting down with them and seeing what happens. I think it's certainly better than threatening military action that doesn't really make any sense. To answer your question, Jay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We have a little bit of time. I want to make sure John gets a chance to question, then ask, and then get a few folks in the back as well.
So I'm John Wolfstall. I direct the Nuclear Crisis Group, and I was in the Obama administration at the NSC, and I was actually at Yongbyon back in 95, 96, so I think I get both of you on that one. Just a word on verification, answering your question, Abe, and then I do have a question. I've never bought into the idea that there would be a Big Bang summit, because even if Kim Jong Un wanted to back up the truck and say, okay, here are the 8 nukes or 12 nukes or whatever, the procedures, the verification, the access would make the Iran deal look simple.
Yeah.
In terms of the transparency that North Korea would have to provide, the forensics that we would have to engage in. You literally have to pull apart Yongbyon reactor to understand the neutronics in the reactor. So you're talking about months to negotiate the framework and years to gain confidence. So like you, not surprisingly, I'm very supportive of the idea the summit would create a sustainable process with milestones, with an objective of denuclearization. I think you can fall back on the nuclear geeks to sort of buy some time on that. I think that's actually valuable. What I'm worried about, and I think you finally have hit on the dynamic when you were talking about why now that Kim Jong Un has sort of launched the charm offensive, quite frankly, it's because Donald Trump was belligerent. And it gave him an opportunity to appeal to the South Korean body politic as the peacemaker. And so the pressure really is on President Trump, I would argue. We're now in a charm race, right? They're both working harder than ever because I think President Trump does, in his own way, recognize that perception in South Korea could really turn against the United States pretty strongly if Kim Jong Un is seen as having been very conciliatory and the U.S. really doesn't. So my question is, what is the dynamic in South Korea right now? Moon Jae-in, my view is he's going to move ahead with engagement whether the summit's a success or not. But how much risk are we in terms of the U.S.-South Korean alliance, whether Admiral Harris takes over? If the summit goes poorly, are we really seeing decoupling before our eyes? I think Donald Trump is likely to return to trade wars, and we've seen what he's asking for in terms of payment for THAAD still continuing. So I'm just worried about how you see that risk in terms of U.S.-South Korean relations.
Okay, let's collect a few more questions in the back.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Mark Tokola from the Korea Economic Institute. And my question is, if I understand correctly, the entire summit between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong Un is going to be televised. That's unusual. So what are the advantages and disadvantages to televising a whole summit?
The whole
And why would each side want to do that?
Are they doing pay-per-view, or is it? And one last question in the back there.
Hi, I'm Tatiana Klomukova from RIA Novosti News Agency. For now, all the news are going on around the US and South Korea, but this pressure campaign and UN sanctions include, obviously, UN Security Council members such as Russia and China. So when do you think other countries will be included in this process, and what role will they play? Who is more, who is less important? And my second question is, do you believe that the US will stop joint military drills with South Korea? Is it possible at all? Thank you.
Okay, so this is our last round, so.
Do you want to get that one question? He's been really
Okay.
persistent.
Okay, very quick one.
Shota Sato from Tokyo Broadcasting. Thank you very much for the insightful discussion. Very quick one. Where do you think the U.S. DPRK summit will be held, and why so? Question mark. Thanks.
I'm going to answer the last one first. I think it's going to be in Pyongyang. Because pay-per-view is one reason. I think it's going to be a ratings-busting, Nobel Peace Prize winning maneuver, that people can make that kind of argument. And I find it highly suspicious that there's no talk of the 3 U.S. detainees who are in North Korea, and I suspect that the North Koreans are saving them for the Trump summit. On the other things, so John, on your question about decoupling, so I see both North Korea's maximum pressure and maximum engagement as different ways to go about decoupling. And we've, maximum pressure to, make the U.S. choose between Seoul or Los Angeles, on maximum engagement by trying to using soft power, winning the hearts and minds of the Chinese as well as the South Koreans, to try to wean the South Korean public and the administration away from the U.S., but also to tap into President Trump's America First national security tendencies to say, you'd be saving so much money if you didn't deploy these strategic assets to the peninsula for all these drills.
Just a couple thoughts. First, I'm intrigued by the Pyongyang possibility, which I think makes you're making a very solid case. I think there's a chance it's held in the United States too. For kind of reverse reasons, maybe even Mar-a-Lago, honestly, or Trump Tower, but
right next door, maybe.
But I find those scenarios, the U.S. or North Korea scenarios, more plausible than like Stockholm, but who knows? I did not know that the Moon Kim summit was going to be a televised live all the way through, but
right?
that's that.
Not just the opening. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's just the opening, which is not unprecedented. Kim Jong-il was, I don't know if that was live, but I do remember that we did see the first handshake and his comments about noodles or the weather.
I was just going to say on USROK, the one thing I'm not sold that Trump himself is thinking about competing with Kim for the affections of South Korea. I don't think that's very present in his mind. But in a way that makes your question all the more important, because given that you don't have a U.S. president who sees the value of this alliance, his willingness to contribute to decoupling in various ways is a different kind of factor and something that should be watched carefully. And I said in my opening that, things like agreeing on ICBMs and saying fine on the short range, that kind of stuff I think is quite concerning. Or being like, on the military drills question, having Trump say, sure, yeah, what do I care about these military drills? Save me money if we don't run them. I think that his mindset on this is so different from either the professional military in the United States or the bipartisan foreign policy consensus that's come before, that is a risk factor that we probably should have lifted up more, and I'm glad that you asked the question. I don't anticipate that there'll be some kind of declared end to U.S. South Korea exercises, but do I think that the nature of these exercises and the question of their future could be on the table in a Trump-Kim summit? I do, absolutely. And in terms of the role of other countries, I mean, we've all talked about China, who has already played a central role both on the maximum pressure side and then in the beginning of this maximum engagement, as Jong was putting it, on North Korea. And that will continue. And then I think there will be, I don't know if there'll be a six-party talks framework going forward, but I think there will be some kind of multilateral context built out of these bilateral summits as we go forward, as the United States and South Korea each try to figure out how to bring in the other key actors in this: Japan, South Korea, to a certain extent Russia. Russia's role in this, it has to decide the degree to which it wants to play a constructive rather than spoiling role, and my guess is that that's an active conversation going on in the Kremlin right now.
I forgot about that other countries question. So, but firstly, I think Mark's question about this televising thing, I think it's also intended to, because there have been so many doubts cast on what exactly Kim said and how the South Koreans are couching whatever Kim said, that this is a way of, or at least a good way of actually putting it all out there for you to see with your own eyes. So I think that makes sense. It's the theater of the summit that that they're looking for, I think. The other thing, on the question about what the other countries can do, I think this links back to what John does for a living, which is to the nuclear nerds go and verify and inspect. So there's that part, going through the processes of what that verification regime looks like, because you guys are very good at it, right? The other countries are very good at it. So working on that, but also, the Tillerson, before he left, started this Vancouver group thing. I think that's a useful forum to make sure that all the foreign ministers are knowledgeable about the North Korea problem, and that they're not just peripheral, that's their issue, or that's the U.S. issue to deal with, or the South Korean issue to deal with, but use that that existing forum or that mechanism to continue to get all of the foreign ministers on board with what's going on, to talk about the verification, to talk about maximum pressure, and also what other countries are better at doing is talking about human rights and transitional justice type issues. So I'll leave it there.
Just a few comments to close out from my end. I think I would be shocked if U.S. South Korea joint military exercises went away. But I do think they certainly can be adjusted. They have been in the past to accommodate diplomacy. In fact, we used to have an exercise called Team Spirit that was postponed and eventually canceled to make way for negotiations with North Korea. So as long as we can maintain readiness and deterrence, I think that it's okay to talk about exercises to a certain degree, so long as we're able to maintain that readiness and deterrence. And in terms of the office pool on where the summit takes place, I thought Jung made a very strong case for Pyongyang. It's still hard for me to see that. I also think the U.S. is probably where the White House would rather do it, somewhere in the U.S., but it's difficult for me to see Kim Jong Un traveling so far afield into hostile territory. So my money has always been on Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia.
Let's take it
You'll
seriously.
see.
Trump.
You'll see. But as the president says, we'll see. So I'll turn things over to Jean to close.
So yes, I am just I just want to thank all of you for coming out. I'm so excited to be here at the Wilson Center. I want to thank Hyundai Motor and Korea Foundation for creating this center. We'll have a very busy year. I think next year will be busy as well. So keep your eyes on this space and come back and join us. I will have some pictures from North Korea up in my office, so come by and say hello, and some artwork.
Great. So thank you for coming, and please join me in thanking the
Yes,
panelists.
thanks to our panelists.